We have 104 points. Let's get into it. Period 1, 1491 to 1607. Native Americans crossed the land bridge over Alaska and they sailed throughout North and South America. Next, Native American tribes were diverse. There are like 4 kinds of Native American, types you need to think of. I'm not trying to diminish those communities. The Navajo tribes in the Southwest, the Pueblos and stuff like that. The second is the Great Plains. They used the buffalo. The Shoshone is a good example. In the Southeast to Mid-Atlantic, they're focused on scavenging, fishing, horticulture, very baseline society stuff. And fourth, we have the Iroquois and Native American tribes around them. They formed the Iroquois Confederacy, and basically these groups of natives adapted to colder regions, and we'll get to them later. Next, European arrival. We have to note Vikings arrived in North America first, but it's really not that important. So, as you should know, Columbus was looking for a sea route to Asia. The Spanish crown funded it because they wanted money and power and to spread Christianity. And these 3 reasons are essentially why every European country wanted to explore. To spread God, get power, and get money. Next, we had the Columbian Exchange. Everything changed when Columbus made contact with the, Americas. Economic structures changed, huge exchange of disease, animals, plants, and basically everything. Think about like this, the Columbian Exchange. Europe got all the good stuff and STDs and horrible legacy 500 years or so later. And America's got all the bad stuff, but, they got horses and, some pretty cool technology. Conquest, so Spain got dibs on everything except for Brazil and northeastern South America. That's because the Pope at the time, he proclaimed this thing called the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. So Portugal could get some land and, no one would complain. Obviously Portugal lost out. Hernan Cortez and other conquistadors destroyed the Aztec, Incan, and Mayan civilizations because of... This is how they won. They won because of disease, better tech, and better tactics. And that's pretty much all you need to know about that. And after they won, they instituted this thing called the encomienda system. Basically, Europeans got land for, settling the area. We'll see this later in different units of how the Americas held the West. It's very similar. Interactions between natives and Europeans, the only thing you need to know is that the natives got Christianity and died and were enslaved, and the Europeans got rich. Very straightforward. Next. So, Spain and Portugal, they began to build empires, and the next unit really focuses on how they managed these empires and how that influenced the burgeoning United States. Alright, that's period 1. So, period 2, 1607 to 1754. So, the context of this, Spain is getting rich, and everyone else wants in on the money, Everyone's chasing a bag. And so, European colonization. The 4 players need to know. Spain, France, Great Britain, and the Netherlands, or Amsterdam, whatever you want to call them. So, Spain was very dominant. They're control freaks. They're like a very controlling, abusive boyfriend. And the Netherlands and France, they're very like hands off. They're chill. Not looking for anything too serious. They just want, they just want some money, man. The British were basically disgusted and just want to create an empire while ignoring the Native Americans. Spain, like a lot of people there, they started, race mixing, which, other Europeans look down upon. But that's how modern day Hispanics were created. That's why the Hispanic community is very diverse, because there's a lot of intermarriage, sometimes consensual and sometimes non-consensually, I can't talk, between African slaves, Native Americans, and Europeans. This happened too with the Dutch and the French, but not as common. The Chesapeake Bay in the south, New England and Mid-Atlantic, and the British West Indies. These were like the 4 main territories that Britain had in the Western Hemisphere. So, basically the south. This was before cotton. So, all you need to know is they grew tobacco and, they used slaves. A lot more than the other colonies did, because it was a lot more labor intensive. In New England, it was very cold, just like how it is now. Very religious space. A lot, the Puritans settled there. Small farms. So the Mid-Atlantic, NYC, it was very diverse. That's one of the big attributes of the Mid-Atlantic territories. And the Mid-Atlantic benefited from the temperate weather, basically meaning, it wasn't too hot or too cold. So, they had farming to an extent, but their main attraction was commerce. And it really served as a hub of trade between the North and the South. And it served as a stopping point from ships coming from Europe to the Americas. Alright, the next thing we have is the transatlantic slave trade. So the globalized trade network with, had crops, slaves, and manufactured tools, they spread across, it's a triangle, Africa to the Americas to Europe. And so a lot of the Europeans allied with Native Americans to fight other Native American and European alliances. So a war you should know is this thing called King Philip's or King Metacom's War. They're the same thing. So what's important is this showed how far the British colonists would go to expand their territory. And it's the first real sign of the British colonists, soon to be Americans, really taking the land of natives. And we had native uprisings under the Spanish Empire in the Southwest, but that you probably won't encounter that during a test. Slavery is next. So this is very important in conceptualizing slavery. So before this, the Romans, Greeks, all the ancient empires, they had slavery, but it didn't exist on how slavery existed now, which is usually referred to as chattel slavery. So chattel slavery usually refers to treating slaves instead of a personal assistant that you own. Well, they still do that. It's just they added all this complex trading networks to it, and slavery was pretty ubiquitous, and it passed down from generation to generation, and that was uncommon with slavery beforehand. And slavery now was it was a lot more based on your heritage rather than being in debt or something like that. Big bummer. So what's next? So basically, America isn't a thing. Just think about the American colonies as England Junior. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So England Junior, basically, they were off doing their own thing. So this period is called salutary neglect because the colonies, they pretty much did whatever they want, and they chose to pretty much just emulate Great Britain. But they added their own flair. So for comparison, 2.8, just think about how Europeans changed the Americas and how Spain approached treating Native Americans compared to France, compared to Britain, compared to the Dutch. That's pretty much it. Ooh, we're getting along quickly. Period 3, 1754 to 1800. We're not even close to being done. So just look at the map. This is too much again. Too. Just look at the map when I put up in the video. Next up, the 7 Years' War. So, a lot to get through. So, this is the First World War. In many ways, this was the first international, global, conflict. Just look at the map. I'm going to put up another map. So, George Washington. Yes, that guy. He attacked French troops outside of Pennsylvania, and the entire world erupted into war. George Washington didn't know this was going to happen, so it's basically just it's a lot like World War One, actually. People, the empires of the world were just looking for an excuse to fight, and George Washington attacking French troops was the excuse to spark this huge war. So basically, you don't really need to know too much about the war, but it's very interesting. Look it up. So this led into taxation, without representation. Know that it rhymes. So Britain won the war. They got, basically Canada, and the map looked like this. I'm just gonna put up another map. So the main thing you need to know about this is this put George Washington, he was in the public consciousness. Also, the proclamation line of 1763. Remember this. Basically, Britain was like, okay, we don't want another war, so colonists cannot settle or live past this line. Just, the line's going to be up there. They also created new taxes and asserted more control over the colonies. So salutary neglect ended because the crown was a lot more assertive with their control. And unsurprisingly, the colonists were pretty upset. And this leads into the American Revolution. So, before the Revolution, you gotta have some ideas. So, like, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. You know, No Common Sense by Thomas Paine. You'll most likely see that document. So, common sense, it convinced people to rebel, American Revolution, all that jazz. You probably know all this. The American Revolution, happens. It starts with the... oh, sorry, I need some water. One take. So, Battle of Lexington and Concord. Then America was losing. Then the winter at the Valley Forge. Then the Battle of Saratoga. Then France was salty over, the French and Indian or 7 Years' War. And, they were convinced to join. Then we cut them off at Yorktown, and, we won the war. That's basically it. An important thing to note is the American Revolution and the American War of Independence, they're usually referred to synonymously, but they're two distinct things. And you might have to, talk about that for a short answer. Think about the American Revolution as like this evolution in the ways Americans thought about their relationship to the crown and to government. And the American Revolutionary War was the war itself. So after this, happy times. So there is no federal government at this time. So the federal government was created, under the Constitution. Well, yeah, I think so. So the Articles of Confederation, they were like the precursors to the Constitution. After the Revolution, basically state governments ran everything. But there's an uprising in western Massachusetts known as Shays' Rebellion. And people were like, man, we probably need, like, a government, like, of all of us, together we're stronger stuff. This leads into the Constitutional Convention and the debates over ratification. So, all the states, came together. They're like, let's create a government, stronger together, blah, blah, blah. There are two things you need to know. The states disagreed over slavery and how representation should happen. So, there's this thing called the New Jersey Plan, basically equal representation for every state, and the Virginia Plan, which wanted representation proportional to population. They compromised, and that's why we have the Senate with equal numbers, and the House of Representatives with, numbers proportional to population. The next thing you need to know about the Constitution is the relationship slavery had to the ratification. So, to get the Constitution passed, a lot of people, they're racist, So, basically, they came to this thing called the 3/5 Compromise, which said that a slave counts as 3/5 as a person. Yeah, pretty messed up stuff. So, the Constitution, there's, it's referred to as the Great Compromise when, like, they figured out, let's just have, the Senate and the House. That's what it's called. The first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights. I'll put them up on screen. Just quickly read through them. Nothing you shouldn't, already know. So, my God. So, wow. We have a lot more to go. So, next, after they make this Constitution, America, breaks up with France. They friend zone the Spanish, who are, they're trying to advance. They make up with their ex, Great Britain, and they kind of have it's complicated relationship with the Native Americans because they're kind of allies, kind of enemies, but they're kind of in between, That's the best way I could put it. That's the simplest way I could put it, actually. So an American identity really starts to form. Instead of being England or Great Britain Junior, they're now America, and that's a huge thing you need to know. So remember the proclamation line. So they don't need to worry about that, so they start moving westward. Very important, foreshadowing for later. So, in this period, basically everything changed. And basically think about how much stuff changed between, the French and Indian War to the ending of George Washington's presidency. Alright, period 4. We're breezing through this. 1800 to 1848. This probably, in my opinion, is the least well-known period of American history, if not the Gilded Age. So, hopefully you'll learn some stuff. So, to continue on with these metaphors, similes, this figurative language. America graduated from high school, and now they're in college. So now they're just trying to grow, improve, find themselves, figure out their relationships, all that stuff. So what's important is, now you probably know we have the Democrats and the Republicans. But early stages of America, we didn't really have defined political parties. So, during this time, the American system of politics really begins to take shape. The Supreme Court gained the power of judicial review, which basically allows them to determine if laws violate the Constitution. That's basically the only thing they do nowadays, so they pretty much did nothing before that for the most part. Political parties really began to grow, and yeah. Well, I'll get into it later. So Jefferson gets done the Louisiana Purchase. America doubles in size pretty much, and he had to go against the Constitution to do it. He was in his feelings. So this is important. This is very important, actually. Something that's very overlooked is, right now, we're very segmented, stratified entire states in America. I live in the Northeast, I live in the South. But that's nothing compared to how it was back then. Back then, people didn't really identify with an American identity as much with their state identity. And over the course of the 1800s, you see Americans start to identify less with the state and more with the country. So that's definitely important. And a big thing about that was a lot of the different areas in America had vastly different economic systems, which led to their vastly different political and cultural systems. A big thing to know is the American system. So basically, the American system basically wanted to have national subsidies and tariffs for everything. It was a big deal back then, so know it. And, America's how do I interact with the rest of the world now that I'm, independent? So, Monroe Doctrine, you need to know that. Basically, they were everything that happens in the Western Hemisphere is our responsibility. It's not the Native Americans' problem. It's not the, Latin nations' problems. It's not Europe's problem. It's our problem. We'll take care of it. And that brings us to the Market Revolution. So these are the early stage of industrialization. Manufacturing began to grow exponentially in the North. And this is contrasted with cotton production just exploding in the South following the invention of the cotton gin. Because cotton is the most profitable thing in the world at this point. So as the North is slowly creating more and more factories, the South is getting more and more into plantation style economics, basically. Railroads begin to, they get introduced, canals and roads, and all these are basically made, for money. America, the government is investing in these projects, and entrepreneurs are investing into these transportation systems for money. Just think about Monopoly when you're getting the railroads. That's basically what's going on. And the results of the market revolution is when we get more power, and the middle class slowly starts to emerge. Expanding democracy, I love expanding democracy, that's my thing. So more white guys were able to vote because they removed property requirements, a step in the right direction. So, Andrew Jackson, important guy you need to know about. So, he was the hero of the War of 1812, Battle of New Orleans. The things you need to know about him is he instituted the Trail of Tears, which displaced and killed a lot of natives. He forced a lot of Native Americans in the Florida southern region to the Midwest. So Jackson also, there's this, very underrated. There's this thing called the nullification crisis. The American system, I talked about earlier. So now that there's a national tariff, the states are man, I don't want to do that. So South Carolina was yeah, we're not following the tariff. And Jackson was I'm the federal government, you have to listen to me. And Jackson was actually considering invading South Carolina, which is pretty crazy. But, they were able to come to a compromise, and this really established, the president as this strong position that we know it to be today. And Jackson also used the veto a lot, which is, basically he vetoed policies that he didn't like that Congress was trying to pass. It existed before, obviously, but he was the first guy to really use it. So, the development of American culture. Let's see. So, high culture. You know what I'm talking about, high culture, the fancy stuff. It was heavily influenced by neoclassical standards, but we put our, American spin on it. If you go to DC, you could see, the influence of neoclassical architecture with, a spin. We put, our own dash of flavor on it. Something you should know is the Hudson River School. So, just Google some pictures of the Hudson River School. I'll put up some of their art. But this really defined the American style of art, at the time at least. So American culture was like renowned at the world as basically this neoclassical style mixed with naturalism and romanticism. So yeah, art stuff. Next, we got the Second Great Awakening. Oh yeah, there's a First Great Awakening, but the curriculum doesn't really they really don't talk about it. Aaron Burr's grandfather was a part of it. Basically, people got more religious. This is the same thing. So, but the thing with this is, Americans got more religious, so they're like, let's change society to reflect our growing religious values. And this manifested in itself in wanting to change things that they saw bad with society. So you really saw women women getting very politically active. And this led to the beginnings of the suffrage movement. And it's also led to, the first, movements against slavery to really take shape in the North. So, while this is going on, we also have the Society of the South form. I think I touched upon it earlier, but the South is really taking this drastic step away from the North. And meanwhile, also remember, you have the West. The West is doing its own thing. So, in the South, it's this thing called the Common Kingdom is forming. Most Southerners didn't own slaves, but most of them supported it, if not accepted it. So, basically stereotypical slavery began to happen, as you know it, with the whipping and stuff, and picking cotton, and all the stereotypes. So just think about, all this stuff that happened. It was, pretty crazy. And how all this stuff led into the Civil War and all this stuff that I'm about to cover. And before we get into period 5, just remember this thing, I didn't touch upon it, but it's called Republican Motherhood. So think about how, basically at the beginning of after the American Revolution, they're the only use of a woman is to cook, clean, and to raise my children to believe in democratic and republican ideas. And slowly, women's role in society is slowly changing over the course of this century. So just keep that in the back of your head. I don't want to skip over it. So, period 5, 1844 to 1877. Basically, all you need to know is what I said before. But America is bigger, stronger, and richer. But, slavery is still a problem, And it's gonna come back to bite us. Manifest destiny. Oh, I'm thirsty. Well, we're halfway there. We're pretty much halfway there. Well, in my estimation, at least, manifest destiny is, what made or completed this idea of the United States. Not the United States itself as a real country, but the idea of it. It's the metaphysical manifestation of the United States. So the manifest destiny goes off of this idea called city upon a hill. Back in the founding of the colonies in New England, back in Unit 1, this guy was oh, this society in the Americas should be an example for the rest of the world, to be this beacon of shining light. And manifest destiny is America's this great place, and it's our destiny to expand and to have land that spans from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And it's pretty much talked in tandem with westward expansion, but it's a lot more than America, go west, okay? It's a lot more than that. It did a lot to change the American identity. Mexican-American War. All you need to know for APUSH, America went to Mexico because of Texas slavery. America won, and they're should this new land we got, should they have slavery or should they not have slavery? So the Compromise of 1850. Just look at this map. Look at this map. It's too much to get into. This undermined the Compromise of 1820, which said all land above here is free, and all land below here has slaves. I'll put up 2 maps, depicting the difference. So next, the identities between the North and the South begin to really, grow at this time. They continue to go on these 2 different paths to manufacturing and diversity and anti-immigrant hate groups in the North. That's As pretty much the North has manufacturing, immigration, and anti-immigration, and the South has it was very agricultural. It had this cash crop culture and had slavery, and these cultural differences, they start to become I can't say it, but the difference between them grows too large, and that's basically one of the causes of the Civil War. The failure of compromise. So the Dred Scott decision passed by the Supreme Court meant it basically said slaves are slaves everywhere, regardless of freedom laws in the North or the West. Popular sovereignty was passed under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it basically said each state should have a public vote to decide if it has slavery. And so, a lot of politicians got so upset they founded the Republican Party, which was opposed to slavery. All right, election of 1860. Lincoln won, and South Carolina seceded because they were scared he was going to outlaw slavery. He never said that he would, but they were scared. Big idea here. A lot of white Northerners opposed slavery on moral grounds, but a majority of them opposed it on the basis of economic policy, because they were scared that slavery was robbing working class white people out of jobs. Even though the South had slavery, there's still a lot of racism in the North. I don't want you to, take away that the South was evil and the North was bad. There's still a lot of racism in the North. And you still see that during, the Civil Rights Movement, which we'll get into later. So, the Confederacy created a government. They're like, I'm ready. And Lincoln was like, no, you ain't. The South had superior generals and home field advantage, but the North had every other advantage, so they won. The North was losing. Then they used the Anaconda Plan to squeeze the life out of the South by having multiple theaters of war and by controlling key ocean ways and river passages and stuff like that. So during the Civil War, 4 things. There are 4 points. Lincoln suspended free speech. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which only freed slaves in the rebelling South and non-slave-holding territories, still a part of the Union. Gettysburg was a big deal, which turned the tide of the war. And the Union maintained moral high ground, so the Confederates want to get international support. That's basically how the government ran during the Civil War. And it's over. The Union wins, the Confederacy loses. You already know that. Reconstruction happens after. So Reconstruction started off with a lot of hope to rebuild the country better, stronger than ever. But Lincoln died, and the guy who took over, Andrew Johnson, was an idiot. And he was from the South. But instead of being, empathetic towards the South, he hated the South. Because a lot of the people who were in power in the South, they undermined him at the beginning of his political career. And when he really rose to, to prominence. What else happened? Basically, Reconstruction was a huge failure, man. During this time, they instituted black codes and the KKK to crush, the slaves from advancing their lives post-slavery. But it wasn't all bad. The slaves still had things like the Freedmen's Bureau and the founding of historically black colleges to support, newly freed slaves. But, yeah, it was pretty much a huge failure. But a good thing about Reconstruction was that before Lincoln, died, they passed 3 amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 13th one, banned slavery, I agree. The 14th Amendment, made everyone born in the U.S. a citizen automatically. And the 15th Amendment gave every guy the right to vote. So, those are some of the good things about Reconstruction. Reconstruction basically ended when the North got tired of funding Reconstruction. They were just, done spending all this cash. And there's this thing called the Bargain of 1777. So Southern Democrats basically allowed Rutherford B. Hayes to be elected president as long as Northern troops left the South. It's this really shady political deal. And, Reconstruction was over. And for the comparison, just compare the North and the South. Pretty straightforward. We're almost done. No, we're not. I lied. 1865 to 1898. This is probably the hardest thing for kids to learn because there's not a lot of representation of this time period in media. But I think it's very interesting. Let's get into it. Contextualizing period 6. The Civil War just ended, man. I just went over it. Westward expansion. So before Lincoln died, he passed this thing called the Homestead Act of 1862. This, gave Americans willing to settle out west land. So the Homestead Act is responsible for, all these Americans moving westward, or these immigrants moving westward to really settle these new states. Similar to the, encomienda system that the Spanish instituted to have people colonize South America and Central America. So yeah, the West, it's pretty lit. We had more food, more natural resources, and because we're extending westward, more infrastructure is created. So, the social and cultural development. So Native American culture was further assimilated into American society. And a lot like messed up stuff is done to erase the Native American identities. So this created the idea of the Wild West, like this further development of the West. Like the Wild West and the cowboys, all those stories began to take shape. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but this really was a big deal. Before the creation of this Wild Western American mythology, America really didn't have fables or folklore to look back on. The only stories we had was about the Revolution. That's the only stuff that we had in common. American culture before this development solely relied on tales from I just said that. I'm dying out here, I'm dying. The New South. So, it wasn't really new. Plessy v. Ferguson allowed segregation to be legal, sharecropping and light manufacturing replaced slavery. Technological innovations such as factories happened. That's all you need to know. The rise of industrial capitalism. So, this serves as the precursor to modern day globalization. Huge factories needed resources from across the world, and companies that ran these factories monopolized the industries that they were a part of. U.S. Steel, led by Andrew Carnegie, controlled steel, obviously. Labor in the Gilded Age. When I took APUSH, it felt like half the test was about the Gilded Age. So, pay attention. These next 7 points are about the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is mid-1870s to early 1900s. Refers to how even though things were looking good after the Civil War with a tech and economic boom, things were actually really bad because of corruption and, inequality across the board. This era saw the first wide-scale attempts at unionization to protect the rights of industrial workers. Next up, we have immigration, migration. The urban populations exploded along with immigration to cities like New York. Get this, right? African Americans went to the north, Asian immigrants to the west, and non-Anglo-Saxon Europeans basically moved to the Midwest and parts of the East Coast. We're done. And people post the immigration, and they cite social Darwinism as to why. Opposing immigration is, a thing of the past. We really don't need to worry about it nowadays. Social welfare programs like halfway houses were started to create the poor. And there's this thing called the Gospel of Wealth, and it became popular during this time. Basically means if you're rich, you should help the poor. Great power, great responsibility, sort of thing. And the middle class started to take shape. Between the trillionaire CEOs and the minimum wage, factory workers, there's a sizable amount of Americans who held a management position, or they were a successful entrepreneur, and not rich, or they're an artist, or they're a farmer. And this American middle class really began to, begin in full. It started during the market revolution, but now a lot more people are living more comfortably. Next, you gotta think about the reforms. Basically, they wanted to change the messed up things in society. Journalists exposed corruption in industry and government. Just think about The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. He exposed bad things in the meat industry, and that caused changes in the meat industry. Yeah, that's basically it. No, I lied. We have a lot more, actually. So, 3 areas, 3 points. In the Midwest, we sell the West now. Now we call it the Midwest because now we have California sold and stuff. So, in the Midwest, in agricultural regions, outside the South, you know what the Midwest is. People start to form political parties that would defend the rights of farmers and the region. On the East Coast, we have these corrupt political machines that would give out political favors in exchange for support. Like Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall is the only example you need to know. And in the South, people were still mad about the Civil War, which wasn't that long ago. And during this time period, the South really started to romanticize the Confederacy. So just think about how much life has changed between the Civil War and now. Technology completely changed the economy. And the market revolution, laid the groundwork, but now America is really becoming a modern nation. Well, what, you know what I mean. Period 7, 1890 to 1945. We're almost there. America rose like a phoenix out of the ashes of the Civil War. And it's probably consensus top 10, top 7 most powerful countries on Earth. Basically, from period 7 to period 9, AP is interested in showing how did America go from this top this world power to the number one world power. It's a big theme. So one way America expanded its powers is through imperialism. Some people wanted to create an empire. Some people wanted to be isolationist. The Spanish-American War happened. All you need to know: America beat Spain, got the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. The media really used journalism, which is just extreme sensationalism, to stir up the war effort. The progressives. So, just like today, the progressives, the progressive movement is very broad. But they have certain traits in common. Basically, they all wanted to institute transformative reforms to, progress society, They were divided on foreign policy and race, but they pretty much all believed in nature, conservation, opposing big business, and getting rid of political corruption. World War I happened. So, yeah. Oh my god, I'm tired. Just gotta get through it. America was neutral at first, but basically Germany used unrestricted U-boat warfare, which are basically submarines. They let their submarines attack everywhere. And a ship, American ships were destroyed. And one ship called the Lusitania was sank and Americans died. And Germany did this thing called the Zimmerman Telegram, where they're like, yo, Mexico, attack America, we got your back. And for all these reasons, America attacked Germany and joined the Allies. So, after the war's over, America, the Allies win. The Treaty of Versailles passes, but when they're debating the treaty, they're like, America, for once had foresight. Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, used 14 points to guide the negotiations. I'll put them up. He's like, we shouldn't punish Germany. We're all kind of responsible, except for America, which is surprising, for the most part. So, the other allies were like, no, let's punish Germany. We're sick and tired of them. America was like, okay. They found the League of Nations, but America's like, there's no point in joining. This was pretty much a failure. On the home front, there were restrictions on free speech, greater crop production, foreshadowing, and they made German Americans erase their heritage. The war also spurred a lot of migrations from And a lot of African Americans started to migrate towards cities in the north because of World War I opportunities like manufacturing or just joining a platoon. And they stayed there when they got back. And this leads into the 1920s. So the African American migrations I just mentioned, a lot of themes of it are featured in Harlem Renaissance artwork. I think I'm from Harlem. I think so, at least. Wait, all right, whatever. Just Google it. I'm sorry if I'm wrong. But 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, blah blah blah. You know, the Great Gatsby and stuff. There are radios now. There are movies. There are cars. America became more urban, and people started to become more xenophobic. And America just started to become isolationist after World War I and just enjoy this like party we had in America. Prohibition happened. Just watch Fantastic Beasts or something. You got the idea. I don't really feel like I need to go get into this. Like, we've all had to read The Great Gatsby for the most part. And next, the Great Depression happened. This isn't how you felt during quarantine. This is, bad joke. The stock market crashed because of idiot spending during the 1920s. They were partying. Droughts ravaged, the American Midwest because of overproduction from World War I. And policies that were passed that restricted international trade, which isn't good, Oh my God. The New Deal was passed. This is a big thing. That's a big thing. Big deal. The New Deal was a big deal. So, FDR was elected. The government was like, we gotta do something about this. The government used this frame of thinking called Keynesian economic theory, which basically argued that high government spending was good for the economy. The feds funded huge infrastructure projects and social relief programs. There are two parts to the New Deal. Pre-1935 and post-1935. So, pre-1935 is like building the Hoover Dam. And like post-1935 is like creating Social Security. Very, very straightforward. The New Deal, a lot of people oppose the New Deal because they're like, oh, we're spending too much money. And the government, is starting to get a lot more powerful. The biggest misconception is that the New Deal ended the Great Depression. I'm trying to find the right way to phrase it. I believe that the New Deal contributed to the Great Depression. It contributed to ending the Great Depression in some capacity. But the debate is, to what extent did the New Deal help end the Great Depression? Some people say a lot, some people say a little bit. And that might be one of a test question or something. But the debate's still going on. There's no right or wrong answer. Well, there are some wrong answers. Interwar foreign policy. So between World War I and World War II, America didn't really do anything. Then World War II happens, Pearl Harbor. America gets the army together. They get, the boys together. They create Japanese internment camps. That's not funny. But, yeah. I'm just tired. They basically allowed illegal Mexican labor for the war effort, which I find interesting. So, America won World War II. Spoiler alert. The two things you need to know is the Battle of Midway. It was like a turning point in the Pacific. In Europe, we launched D-Day invasion in France, Normandy, blah blah blah, the beaches. And with the help from the USSR and Great Britain, we destroyed the Nazis. And in the Pacific, America used the island hopping strategy to slowly crush the Japanese. It's actually, it's kind of similar to the Anaconda plan actually. So we used not one, not three, but 2 nukes to end the war, creating the atomic age of science. And some people were kind of disgusted by America's choice to use nuclear warfare. So post-war, basically, America liberated a lot of lands. They became capitalist and democratic-ish. Looking at you, South Korea. And the lands the USSR liberated became communist and authoritarian. Pretty much, yeah. Very good. Yeah, that's a pretty accurate generalization. For this, for 7.15, just think about how America went from, a fan favorite character to the main character of, the show. Period 8, 1945 to 1980. Alright. America had to decide what they were going to do with all this power after World War II, and how they were going to handle the Soviet Union. That's basically the big thing of this period. The Cold War isn't like a normal war. So the two powers fought each other, but the way they fought was like through like economic policies and by convincing smaller countries to fight other smaller countries. So like the two teams, like instead of like a traditional conflict, they just fought like proxy wars. So the two teams were like USA and NATO, and the USSR and the Warsaw Pact, and occasionally they would get together in the UN and try to do stuff. Oh yeah, this isn't important, but the UN was passed after World War II to like be a better League of Nations, because the League of Nations failed to prevent World War II. So, forgot to mention that. The Red Scare happened. America was scared of communism, you know. I think we still are to an extent. So society was like, you know, it was like Among Us, except for like an imposter being like 2 in 10. An imposter was like 1 in 1,000. So yeah, just think about it like that. The economy after 1945, the GI Bill raised the standard of living. There was a baby boom. Everything was good. Culture after 1945, very homogenous and you know very like America, very American. Just if you played a Fallout game, it's just like Fallout, like pre-war culture. The Civil Rights Movement happened. I don't want to minimize the Civil Rights Movement, you know, but the curriculum kind of doesn't care about the Civil Rights Movement. But it's very important, you know, Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights Act, blah, 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 you know. You should know this stuff. But the test kind of doesn't. AP doesn't really care about it. America as a world power, you know, Eisenhower in his farewell address warned against the military-industrial complex. America was really desperate to be the #1 country and to beat the USSR, that they were giving private contractors a lot of power. And, you know, they still have a lot of power now. The Vietnam War happened. America staged the Gulf of Tonkin incident to invade Vietnam. So basically, the American public was told to lie so America could go to war. That's a real thing. Which is kind of scary if you think about it. The war wasn't like World War II with a lot of glory, or even the Korean War that happened before. Most of the war was spent defending against northern invasions and hunting down Viet Cong. Just play Black Ops 1. Just play Black Ops 1. The Great Society. Lyndon B. Johnson passed programs to eliminate poverty. Like, you know, he took power after JFK died. Basically, Medicare and Medicaid, and he improved Social Security. All things I like. And it's okay if you don't like it, I like it. So the Civil Rights Movement, you know, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed to create racial equality. I'm thirsty. And the big thing is, it was passed after effective uses of nonviolent methods. Here's the big thing. African Americans, even during 1776 and even like during slavery, people were protesting for the rights of African Americans and other minority groups. Like, it's just during the 1960s, these movements started to become successful. But even before the 1960s, people were still rallying for justice for these groups. So don't think like, oh, it's the 1960s, let's get mad. People were always trying to do the right thing throughout American history. It's just during the 1960s they started to break through. And after the Civil Rights Movement expanded, like other minority groups like Hispanics, women, LGBTQ groups began protesting en masse as well. Youth culture in the 1960s. Basically, hippies, the concept of a teenager or a young adult kind of became a thing in media. So the modern concept of like a teenager is only like 60 years old. It's just young white people complaining. Same thing we have now. The Environment and Natural Resources from 1968 to 1980. Silent Spring exposed harmful effects of pesticides. Very influential book. And Nixon created the EPA and the Clean Air Act. Society in transition. Basically, there's a lot of turmoil in America during this time period. And they were like, oh, what should we do? And as a response to all these changes, there's a rise of conservatism, and a lot of like on both sides, people were like kind of hurt by certain things that are happening. For like hippies, they were just heartbroken over Vietnam and seeing like their fellow young white people, or young people die in general, or just senseless killing. Like that was really like traumatizing to them. And for conservatives, they were seeing like all these changes. If you're racist, the civil rights movement must be so bad for you. And even for like non-racist conservatives, like Roe v. Wade, I'm not trying to get political, but Roe v. Wade, like, it made a lot of people, a lot of conservatives, question their belief in the government and what's good, and it made everyone was questioning their belief in the country. That's basically what I'm trying to say. Basically, like, yeah, that's it. So just think about how much America has changed since World War II. Like, segregation is kind of over, but racism's still there. Vietnam's happening. There's pollution and a declining economy. But some things are getting better and getting worse at the same time. Oh my god. Period 9. 1980 to now. So, as I said, people got more conservative. There was a crisis of national confidence following Nixon, and Jimmy Carter was seen as weak, and we were like, oh, we need a strong president. So Reagan, he was like, oh, let's make America great again. He won 1980. He wanted to deregulate the economy, lower social welfare programs, trickle down economics, and he wanted to be more aggressive internationally. So the end of the Cold War happened. Tear down this wall, glasnost and perestroika. Early Reagan was a lot more progressive, and then he was like a lot more diplomatic. Like, he made the Soviets bankrupt themselves by basically making America spend half of its budget on military stuff, which we're still doing now. But, it did what it was supposed to do, and it kind of ended communism. And even people who lived in communist countries, they were like, oh, this sucks. Basically, during the 80s and onward, you see this transition from a manufacturing economy to a technology service economy. And wages for the middle class began to stop growing or stop expanding at the rate that it was previously, which is still going on now. 1990s to 2000s, you see a lot more immigration, way more Asians, way more Latinos. Challenges of the 21st century, 9/11, that's it. Causation. Just think about cause and effect. Like, the rise in conservatism led to conservative policies. Yeah, and implementation of new tech led to, like, changing employment patterns. Stuff like that. And we're done. That was basically 107 lessons from AP History in an hour. Thank you for watching. Hope you learned something. And even if you didn't, I don't know. Hope you enjoyed it. That's all I could say.